partner in the future. It will be a growing and a closer relationship. We have a delicate, tight wire walk that we must go through at the present time to make sure that we do not cozy up to tyrants, to make sure that they don't get the impression that they can suppress their people. But time is our friend there, because their leaders will change in not too many years, worst case. And their country is making great progress. One last point on the missiles. I don't want the American people to be confused. We have written agreements, and we have some missiles that have been destroyed. But we have a huge number of intercontinental ballistic missiles that are still in place in Russia. The fact that you have an agreement is one thing. Till they're destroyed, some crazy person can either sell them or use them.
All right, the next question goes to President Bush for a 2-minute answer, and Ann will ask it.
Mr. President, how can you watch the killing in Bosnia and the ethnic cleansing or the starvation and anarchy in Somalia and not want to use America's might, if not America's military, to try to end that kind of suffering?
And both of them are very complicated situations. And I vowed something because I learned something from Vietnam. I am not going to commit U.S. forces until I know what the mission is, till the military tell me that it can be completed, until I know how they can come out. We are helping. American airplanes are helping today on humanitarian relief for Sarajevo. It is America that's in the lead in helping with humanitarian relief for Somalia. But when you go to put somebody else's son or daughter into war, I think you got to be a little bit careful, and you have to be sure that there's a military plan that can do this. You have ancient ethnic rivalries that have cropped up as Yugoslavia is dissolved or getting dissolved, and it isn't going to be solved by sending in the 82nd Airborne. And I'm not going to do that as Commander-in-Chief. I am going to stand by and use the moral persuasion of the United States to get satisfaction in terms of prison camps, and we're making some progress there, and in terms of getting humanitarian relief in there. And right now, as you know, the United States took the lead in a no-fly operation up there in a no-fly order up in the United Nations. We're working through the international organizations. That's one thing I learned by forging that tremendous and highly successful coalition against Saddam Hussein, the dictator. Work internationally to do it. I am very concerned about it. I'm concerned about ethnic cleansing. I'm concerned about attacks on Muslims, for example, over there. But I must stop short of using American force until I know how those young men and women are going to get out of there, as well as get in, know what the mission is, and define it. And I think I'm on the right track.
Are you designing a mission?
Ann, sorry. Time is up. We have to go to Mr. Perot for a 1-minute response.
I think if we learned anything in Vietnam, it's you first commit this nation before you commit the troops to the battlefield. We cannot send our people all over the world to solve every problem that comes up. This is basically a problem that is a primary concern to the European community. Certainly, we care about the people, we care about the children, we care about the tragedy. But it is inappropriate for us, just because there's a problem somewhere around the world, to take the sons and daughters of working people, and make no mistake about it, our all-volunteer armed force is not made up of the sons and daughters of the beautiful people. It's the working folks who send their sons and daughters to war, with a few exceptions. Very unlike World War II, when FDR's sons flew missions. Everybody went. It's a different world now. It's very important that we not just, without thinking it through, just rush to every problem in the world and have our people torn to pieces.
Governor Clinton, 1 minute.
I agree that we cannot commit ground forces to become involved in the quagmire of Bosnia or in the tribal wars of Somalia. But I think that it's important to recognize that there are things that can be done short of that, and that we do have interests there. There are, after all, 2 million refugees now because of the problems in what was Yugoslavia, the largest number since World War II. And there may be hundreds of thousands of people who will starve or freeze to death in this winter. The United States should try to work with its allies and stop it. I urged the President to support this air cover, and he did, and I applaud that. I applaud the no-fly zone, and I know that he's going back to the United Nations to try to get authority to enforce it. I think we should stiffen the embargo on the Belgrade government, and I think we have to consider whether or not we should lift the arms embargo now on the Bosnians, since they are in no way in a fair fight with a heavily armed opponent bent on ethnic cleansing. We can't get involved in the quagmire, but we must do what we can.
All right, moving on now to divisions in our country. The first question goes to Governor Clinton for 2 minutes, and Ann will ask it.
Governor Clinton, can you tell us what your definition of the word family is?
A family involves at least one parent, whether natural or adoptive, or foster, and children. A good family is a place where love and discipline and good values are transmuted from the elders to the children. A place where people turn for refuge and where they know they're the most important people in the world. America has a lot of families that are in trouble today. There's been a lot of talk about family values in this campaign. I know a lot about that. I was born to a widowed mother who gave me family values and grandparents. I've seen the family values of my people in Arkansas. I've seen the family values of all these people in America who are out there killing themselves, working harder for less, in a country that's had the worst economic years in 50 years and the first decline in industrial production ever. I think the president owes it to family values to show that he values America's families. Whether there are people on welfare, you're trying to move from welfare to work, the working poor, whom I think deserve a tax break to lift them above poverty if they've got a child in the house and working 40 hours a week, working families who deserve a fair tax system and the opportunity for constant retraining. They deserve a strong economy, and I think they deserve a Family and Medical Leave Act. 72 other nations have been able to do it. Mr. Bush vetoed it twice because he says we can't do something 72 other countries do, even though there was a small business exemption. So with all the talk about family values, I know about family values. I wouldn't be here without them. The best expression of my family values is that tonight's my 17th wedding anniversary, and I'd like to close my question by just wishing my wife a happy anniversary and thanking my daughter for being here.
President Bush, 1 minute.
Well, I would say that one meeting that made a profound impression on me was when the mayors of the big cities, including the mayor of Los Angeles, a Democrat, came to see me, and they unanimously said the decline in urban America stems from the decline in the American family. So I do think we need to strengthen family. When Barbara holds an AIDS baby, she's showing a certain compassion for family. When she reads to children, the same thing. I believe that discipline and respect for the law, all of these things should be taught to children, not in our schools, but families have to do that. I'm appalled at the highest, outrageous numbers of divorces. It happens in families, it's happened in ours, but it's gotten too much. And I just think that we ought to do everything we can to respect the American family. It can be a single-parent family. Those mothers need help, and one way to do it is to get these deadbeat fathers to pay their obligations to these mothers. That'll help strengthen the American family, and there's a whole bunch of other things that I can't click off in this short period of time.
All right, Mr. Perot, you have 1 minute.
If I had to solve all the problems that face this country, and I could be granted one wish as we started down the trail to rebuild the job base, the schools, and so on and so forth, I would say a strong family unit in every home, where every child is loved, nurtured, and encouraged. A little child before they're 18 months learns to think well of himself or herself or poorly. They develop a positive or negative self-image. At a very early age, they learn how to learn. If we have children who are not surrounded with love and affection, see, I look at my grandchildren and wonder if they'll ever learn to walk because they're always in someone's arms. And I think, my gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if every child had that love and support? But they don't. We will not be a great country unless we have a strong family unit in every home. And I think you can use the White House as a bully pulpit to stress the importance of these little children, particularly in their young and formative years, to mold these little precious pieces of clay so that they too can live rich, full lives when they're grown.
New question, 2-minute answer, goes to President Bush. Sandy will ask it.
Mr. President, there's been a lot of talk about Harry Truman in this campaign, so much so that I think tomorrow I'll wake up and see him named as the next commissioner of baseball.
They could use
But the thing that Mr. Truman didn't have to deal with was drugs. Americans are increasingly alarmed about drug-related crimes in cities and suburbs, and your administration is not the first to have grappled with this. And are you at all of a mind that maybe it ought to go to another level, if not to what's advocated by William F. Buckley Jr. and Milton Friedman, legalization, somewhere between there and where we are now?
No, I don't think that's the right answer. I don't believe legalizing narcotics is the answer. I just don't believe that's the answer. I do believe that there's some fairly good news out there. The use of cocaine, for example, by teenagers is dramatically down. But we've got to keep fighting on this war against drugs. We're doing a little better in interdiction. Many of the countries below that used to say, well, this is the United States problem, if you'd get the demand down, then we wouldn't have the problem, are working cooperatively with the DEA and other the military. We're using the military more now in terms of interdiction. Our funding for recovery is up, recovering the addicts. Where we're not making the progress, Sander, is we're making it in teenagers, and thank God, because I thought what Ross said was most appropriate about these families and these children. But where we're not making it is with the confirmed addicts. And I'll tell you one place that's working well, and that is the private sector. Jim Burke and this task force that he has, you may know about it. I'll tell the American people, but this man said, I'll get you $1 million a day in pro bono advertising, something that's very hard for the government to do, and he went out and he did it. And people are beginning to educate through this program, teaching these kids you shouldn't use drugs. So we're still in the fight, but I must tell you, I think legalization of narcotics or something of that nature in the face of the medical evidence would be totally counterproductive. And I oppose it, and I'm going to stand up and continue to oppose it.
Mr. Perot? Mr. Perot, 1 minute.
Anytime you think you want to legalize drugs, go to a neonatal unit, if you can get in. They're between 100 and 200% capacity up and down the East Coast. And the reason is crack babies being born. Babies in the hospital 42 days. Typical cost to you and me is $125,000. Again and again and again, the mother disappears in 3 days. And the child becomes a ward of the state because he's permanently and genetically damaged. Just look at those little children, and if anybody can even think about legalizing drugs, they've lost me. Now let's look at priorities. You know, we went on the Libyan raid. Remember that one? Because we were worried to death that Gaddafi might be building up chemical weapons. We've got chemical warfare being conducted against our children on the streets in this country all day, every day, and we don't have the will to stamp it out. And then again, if I get up there, if you send me, we're going to have some blunt talks about this, and we're really going to get down in the trenches and say, is this one you want to talk about or fix? Because talk won't do it, folks. There are guys that couldn't get a job, third shift in a Dairy Queen, driving BMWs and Mercedes selling drugs. And these old boys are not going to quit easy.
Right. Governor Clinton, 1 minute.
Like Mr. Perot, I have held crack babies in my arms. But I know more about this, I think, than anybody else up here because I have a brother who's a recovering drug addict. I'm very proud of him. But I can tell you this, if drugs were legal, I don't think he'd be alive today. I am adamantly opposed to legalizing drugs. He is alive today because of the criminal justice system. That's a mistake. What should we do? First, we ought to prevent more of this on the street. 30 years ago, there were 3 policemen for every crime. Now there are 3 crimes for every policeman. We need 100,000 more police on the street. I have a plan for that. Secondly, we ought to have treatment on demand. Thirdly, we ought to have boot camps for first-time nonviolent offenders so they can get discipline and treatment and education and get reconnected to the community before they're severed and sent to prison, where they can learn how to be first-class criminals. There is a crime bill that lamentably was blocked from passage once again, mostly by Republicans in the United States Senate, which would have addressed some of these problems. That crime bill is going to be one of my highest priorities next January if I become president.
Next question is to you, Mr. Perot. You have 2 minutes to answer it, and John will ask it.
Mr. Perot, racial division continues to tear apart our great cities, the last episode being this spring in Los Angeles. Why is this still happening in America, and what would you do to end it?
All right, this is a relevant question here tonight. First thing I'd do is during political campaigns, I would urge everybody to stop trying to split this country into fragments and appeal to the differences between us and then wonder why the melting pot's all broken to pieces after November the 3rd. We are all in this together. We ought to love one another because united teams win and divided teams lose. And if we can't love one another, we ought to get along with one another. And if you can't get there, just recognize we're all stuck with one another because nobody's going anywhere, right? Now, that ought to get everybody back up to let's get along together and make it work. Our diversity is a strength. We've turned it into a weakness. Now, again, the White House is a bully pulpit. I think whoever's in the White House should just make it absolutely unconscionable and inexcusable. And if anybody's in the middle of a speech at one of these conventions, I would expect the candidate to go out and lift him off the stage if he starts preaching hate, because we don't have time for it. See, our differences are our strengths. We have got to pull together. In athletics, we know it. See, divided teams lose, united teams win. We have got to unite and pull together, and there's nothing we can't do. But if we sit around blowing all this energy out the window on racial strife and hatred, we are stuck with a sure loser, because we have been a melting pot. We're becoming more and more of a melting pot. Let's make it a strength, not a weakness.
Governor Clinton, 1 minute.
I grew up in the segregated South, thankfully raised by a grandfather with almost no formal education, but with a heart of gold, who taught me early that all people were equal in the eyes of God. I saw the winds of hatred divide people and keep the people of my state poorer than they would have been spiritually and economically. And I've done everything I could in my public life to overcome racial divisions. We don't have a person to waste in this country. We are being murdered economically because we have too many dropouts, we have too many low birth weight babies, we have too many drug addicts as kids, we have too much violence, we are too divided by race, by income, by region. And I have devoted a major portion of this campaign to going across this country and looking for opportunities to go to white groups and African American groups and Latino groups and Asian American groups and say the same thing. If the American people cannot be brought together, we can't turn this country around. If we can come together, nothing can stop us.
Mr. President, 1 minute.
Well, I think Governor Clinton is committed. I do think it's fair to note, he can rebut it, that Arkansas is one of the few states that doesn't have any civil rights legislation. I've tried to use the White House as the bully pulpit, speaking out against discrimination. We've passed 2 very forward-looking civil rights bills. It's not going to be all done by legislation, but I do think that you need to make an appeal every time you can to eliminate racial divisions and discrimination. And I'll keep on doing that and pointing to some legislative accomplishment to back it out. I have to take 10 seconds here at the end. The red light isn't on yet. To say to Ross Perot, please don't say to the DEA agents on the street that we don't have the will to fight drugs. Please, I've watched these people, the same for our local law enforcement people. We're backing up every way we possibly can, but maybe you meant that some in the country don't have the will to fight it, but those that are out there on the front line, as you know, you've been a strong backer of law enforcement, really, I just want to clear that up, have the will to fight it, and frankly, some of them are giving their lives.
Time, Mr. President. All right, let's go now to another subject, the subject of health. The first question for 2 minutes is to President Bush, and John will ask it.
Mr. President, yesterday, tens of thousands of people paraded past the White House to demonstrate their concern about the disease AIDS. A celebrated member of your commission, Magic Johnson, quit, saying that there was too much inaction. Where is this widespread feeling coming from that your administration is not doing enough about AIDS?
Coming from the political process, we have increased funding for AIDS. We've doubled it on research and on every other aspect of it. My request for this year was $4.9 billion for AIDS, 10 times as much per AIDS victim as per cancer victim. I think that we're showing the proper compassion and concern. So I can't tell you where it's coming from, but I am very much concerned about AIDS, and I believe that we've got the best researchers in the world out there at NIH working the problem. We're funding them. I wish there was more money, but we're funding them far more than any time in the past, and we're going to keep on doing that. I don't know, I was a little disappointed in Magic because he came to me and I said, now if you see something we're not doing, get a hold of me, call me, let me know. He went to one meeting, and then we heard that he was stepping down, so he's been replaced by Mary Fisher, who electrified the Republican convention by talking about the compassion and the concern that we feel. It was a beautiful moment, and I think she'll do a first-class job on that commission. So I think the appeal is, yes, we care. And the other thing is, part of AIDS, it's one of the few diseases where behavior matters. And I once called on somebody, well, change your behavior. If the behavior you're using prone to cause AIDS, change the behavior. Next thing I know, one of these ACT UP groups is out saying Bush ought to change his behavior. You can't talk about it rationally. The extremes are hurting the AIDS cause. To go into a Catholic Mass in a beautiful cathedral in New York under the cause of helping in AIDS and start throwing condoms around in the Mass, I'm sorry, I think it sets back the cause. We cannot move to the extreme. We've got to care. We've got to continue everything we can at the federal and the local level. Barbara, I think, is doing a superb job in destroying the myth about AIDS. And all of us are in this fight together. All of us care. Do not go to the extreme.
1 minute, Mr. Perot.
First, I think Mary Fisher was a great choice. We're lucky to have her heading the commission. Secondly, I think one thing that if I were sent to do the job, I would sit down with FDA, look exactly where we are. Then I would really focus on, let's get these things out. If you're going to die, you don't have to go through this 10-year cycle that FDA goes through on new drugs. Believe me, people with AIDS are more than willing to take that risk. And we could be moving out to the human population a whole lot faster than we are on some of these new drugs. So I think we can expedite the problem there. Let me go back a minute to racial divisiveness. All-time low in our country was the Judge Thomas Anita Hill hearings, and those senators ought to be hanging their heads in shame for what they did there. Second thing, not many times in your life when you get to talk to the whole country, but let me just say this to all of America. If you hate people, I don't want your vote. That's how strongly I feel about it.
Governor Clinton, 1 minute.
Over 150,000 Americans have died of AIDS. Well over 1.25 million Americans are HIV positive. We need to put one person in charge of the battle against AIDS to cut across all the agencies that deal with it. We need to accelerate the drug approval process. We need to fully fund the act named for that wonderful boy, Ryan White, to make sure we're doing everything we can on research and treatment. And the president should lead a national effort to change behavior, to keep our children alive in the schools, responsible behavior, to keep people alive. This is a matter of life and death. I've worked in my state to reduce teen pregnancy and illness among children, and I know it's tough. The reason Magic Johnson resigned from the AIDS Commission is because the statement you heard tonight from Mr. Bush is the longest and best statement he's made about it in public. And I'm proud of what we did at the Democratic Convention, putting 2 HIV positive people on the platform, and I'm proud of the leadership that I'm going to bring to this country in dealing with the AIDS crisis.
New question for Mr. Perot. You have 2 minutes to answer, and Ann will ask it.
Mr. Perot, even if you've got what people say are the guts to take on changes in the most popular, the most sacred of the entitlements, Medicare, people say you haven't a prayer of actually getting anything passed in Washington. Since a president isn't a lone ranger, how in the world can you make some of those unpopular changes?
2 ways. Number one, if I get there, it will be a very unusual and historical event because the people, not the special interests, put me there. I will have a unique mandate. I have said again and again, and this really upsets the establishment in Washington, that we're going to inform the people in detail on the issues through an electronic town hall so that they really know what's going on. They will want to do what's good for our country. Now, all these fellows with $1,000 suits and alligator shoes running up and down the halls of Congress that make policy now, the lobbyists, the PAC guys, the foreign lobbyists, and what have you, they'll be over there in the Smithsonian, you know. Because we're going to get rid of them. And the Congress will be listening to the people, and the American people are willing to have fair, shared sacrifice. They're not as stupid as Washington thinks they are. The American people are bright, intelligent, caring, loving people who want a great country for their children and grandchildren. And they will make those sacrifices. So I welcome that challenge, and just watch. Because if the American people send me there, we'll get it done. Now, everybody will faint in Washington. They've never seen anything happen in that town. This is a town where the White House says Congress did it, Congress says the White House did it, and I'm sitting there and say, well, who else could be around? You know, then when they get off by themselves, they said nobody did it. And yet the cash register is empty, and it used to have our money, the taxpayers' money, in it, and we didn't get the results. No, we'll get it done. We'll have to cheat.
Governor, 1 minute.
Ross, that's a great speech, but it's not quite that simple. I mean, look at the facts. Both parties in Washington, the president and the Congress, have cut Medicare. The average senior citizen is spending a higher percentage of income on health care today than they were in 1965 before Medicare came in. The president's got another proposal to require them to pay $400 a year more for the next 5 years. But if you don't have the guts to control cost by changing the insurance system and taking on the bureaucracies and the regulation of health care in the private and public sector, you can't fix this problem. Costs will continue to spiral. And just remember this, folks. A lot of folks on Medicare are out there every day making the choice between food and medicine. Not poor enough for Medicare, Medicaid, not wealthy enough to buy their medicine. I've met them, people like Mary Annie and Edward Davis in Nashua, New Hampshire, all over this country. They cannot even buy medicine. So let's be careful. When we talk about cutting health care costs, let's start with the insurance companies and the people that are making a killing instead of making our people healthy.
1 minute, President Bush.
Well, first place, I'd like to clear up something, because every 4 years, the Democrats go around and say, hey, Republicans are going to cut Social Security and Medicare. They started it again. I'm the president that stood up and said, don't mess with Social Security. And I'm not going to, and we haven't. And we are not going to go after the Social Security recipient. I have one difference with Mr. Perot on that, because I don't think we need to touch Social Security. What we do need to do, though, is control the growth of these mandatory programs. And Ross properly says, okay, there's some pain in that. But Governor Clinton refuses to touch that, simply refuses. So what we've got to do is control it to the growth, let it grow for inflation, let it grow for the amount of new people added, population, and then hold the line. And I believe that is the way you get the deficit down, not by the tax and spend program that we hear every 4 years, whether it's Mondale, Dukakis, whoever else it is. I just don't believe we ought to do that. So hold the line on Social Security and put a cap on the growth of the mandatory program.
New question. It is for Governor Clinton. 2-minute answer. Sandy will ask it.
Governor Clinton, Ann Compton has brought up Medicare. I remember in 1965 when Wilbur Mills of Arkansas, the chairman of Ways and Means, was pushing it through the Congress. The charge against it was it socialized medicine. One,
Mr. Bush made that charge.
Well, he served with him two years later in 1967, where I first met him. The second point, though, is that it is now skyrocketing out of control. People want it. We say it's going bonkers. Is not the Oregon plan applied to Medicaid rationing the proper way to go, even though the federal government last August ruled that violated the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990?
Well, I thought the Oregon plan should at least have been allowed to be tried because at least the people in Oregon were trying to do something. But let me go back to the main point, Sandy. Mr. Bush is trying to run against Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter and everybody in the world but me in this race. I have proposed a managed competition plan for health care. I will say again, you cannot control health care costs simply by cutting Medicare. Look what's happened. The federal government has cut Medicare and Medicaid in the last few years. States have cut Medicaid. We've done it in Arkansas under budget pressures. But what happens? More and more people get on the rolls as poverty increases. If you don't control the health care costs of the entire system, you cannot get control of it. Look at our program. We set up a national ceiling on health care costs tied to inflation and population growth set by health care providers, not by the government. We provide for managed competition, not government models, in every state, and we control private and public health care costs. Now, just a few days ago, a bipartisan commission of Republicans and Democrats, more Republicans than Democrats, said my plan will save the average family $1,200 a year more than the Bush plan will by the year 2000, $2.2 trillion in the next 12 years, $400 billion a year by the end of this decade. I've got a plan to control health care costs, but you can't just do it by cutting Medicare. You have to take on the insurance companies, the bureaucracies, and you have to have cost controls, yes, but keep in mind, we are spending 30% more on health care than any country in the world, any other country. And yet we have 35 million people uninsured. We have no preventive and primary care. The Oregon plan is a good start if the federal government's going to continue to abandon its responsibilities. I say if Germany can cover everybody and keep costs under inflation, if Hawaii can cover 98% of their people at lower health care costs than the rest of us, if Rochester, New York can do it with 2/3 of the cost of the rest of us, America can do it too. I'm tired of being told we can't. I say we can. We can do better, and we must.
President Bush, 1 minute.
Well, I don't have time in 30 seconds or whatever minute to talk about our health care reform plan. Oregon plan made some good sense, but it's easy to dismiss the concerns of the disabled. As president, I have to be sure that those waivers, which we're approving all over the place, are covered under the law. Maybe we can work it out. But the Americans for Disabilities Act, speaking about sound and sensible civil rights legislation, was the foremost piece of legislation passed in modern times. And so we do have something more than a technical problem. Governor Clinton clicked off the things that you got to take on insurance companies and bureaucracies. He failed to take on somebody else, the malpractice suit people.